Okay, well, welcome to episode 7 of my Take Better Photographs series, aimed very much at beginning and intermediate people. I don't think we've been through anything particularly advanced. I've been very careful to try and keep it approachable, and I hope I've managed to do that. The topic tonight is composition, and of all the topics that I've tackled so far, this one and the depth of field one were the ones that I thought would be the most difficult to explain. Depth of field from technical point of view, but this one, composition, because it's just so subjective. I did get a comment on our YouTube channel recently about talking about rules in photography and how there aren't any rules, and how I was talking a load of rubbish, which was maybe a little bit harsh, I thought. But anyway, I did take the comment to heart, and I thought, well, there's not rules. Let's just start with this idea that there's no rules in composition. Although actually at the end of this evening, I do have one rule, which I think is unbreakable, but we'll see what you think about that. It's more of a series of guidelines, to quote a line from a movie. And some things work better than others. And you've got to realize that there's a visual language here that has become established over many, many years, not just in photography, but in the world of painting, art, all sorts of things, proportions, balance, and everything. And if you've ever studied art history, you'll know what I'm talking about. Now, a lot of photographers never bother with art history, but there's an enormous amount to learn. And there's become a body of knowledge that's been applied to creating visual objects over the last, well, however long people have been painting on things, basically. And some things work better than others. So there are some guidelines which are worth explaining. And if you're starting in photography, it can be a bit mystifying. Now, there's a question which I'll address at first, which is from Jay. Oh, hey, Jay. Has the rule of thirds become cliche? Well, the answer to that, I guess, is yes and no, but I'm going to talk about that in a very short while. So we should probably start. Let me just flick to my first slide. There we go. Down in the corner here. All right, composition. I've got a little definition for you here. Composition helps to hold the viewer's attention and clearly communicate the intent of the image. And the reason I say helps is you've obviously got to have an interesting subject. There's not a lot of point in having a fantastic composition if the picture's really boring. Although, again, boring or interesting is very subjective in itself. What's really, really interesting to me might be really, really boring to you, and vice versa. But composition is a way of arranging the elements in your frame. And remember, this is something that you need to really get your head around, is that everything we do is in a frame. Everything we do is relative to that frame. A bit left, a bit right, high, low, near the edge, near the middle, and so on. Everything is framed. That's what photographs and paintings do. You have a hard limit, which of course is not real life. So we are defining a boundary, and the elements in that frame can be arranged in many, many different ways, and some are more pleasing than others. So composition is a language with conventions and a broadly agreed upon grammar. This is very, very true. For instance, and I'll have more to say about this in a sec, something that's plumb in the middle of the frame broadly is communicating static, stable. Something that's way off center is unstable because it might be unbalancing the picture, and that's a bit more dynamic. There may be some movement implied in that, and so on. So there's no rules that you must absolutely adhere to. Otherwise, it'd be a very boring process, photography, because we'd all take the pictures in the same way. But there absolutely are guidelines which make your pictures more or less compelling. But the idea is to use these guidelines to make your pictures look appealing to the viewer, so that the viewer looks at it and is engaged. And they're not tricks. There's a bit of optical illusion going on, but basically what's going on in here, the eye-brain interface, it appreciates certain input. It's attracted to certain things, and I'll have a little bit to talk about what attractors are in the image in a short while too. So some things just attract your attention, and if you can play with that and know what they are, it means that you can create a stronger image. So I'm going to go through these topics. I'm not going to read them out to you. You can read them on the screen for yourself. But the idea is I'm just going to go through these basic principles. There is a lot more that we could talk about. I could go on for hours about this stuff, really. But it often involves a two-way conversation because some things are very much dependent on other things. Some compositions lend themselves to certain subjects and other compositions to other subjects. So it is such a slippery concept, such a wide-reaching subject, that I'm just going to limit myself to these basic 7 sort of sections. So this is what we're going to be going through this evening. First of these, and I had to put a cat picture in, didn't I? Because this is the internet after all, and the internet is run by cats, as we all know. Fill the frame. This is the most basic piece of advice I can give anybody who is taking images on any camera, phone, whatever. Okay. The biggest single rookie error, and this applies up the scale more to people who've got proper cameras and maybe more intermediate, is they don't fill the frame. Now, you don't have to fill the frame, but it will never hurt if you do. And the reason I say that is because it clearly communicates what the picture's of. I don't know if you've ever been shown a picture on a phone or on an iPad or something, and the person has to point out the subject and then like pinch it and zoom in and say, oh, that's what I took the picture of. Isn't that amazing? Well, really nice if you'd actually photograph that a bit more bold. So the left-hand picture here, this is in one of the Greek islands. It's a picture of Greek island cats, and it's got some context. Yes, okay, we can see roughly where we are, but it's not organized. The brown cat in the middle is bang in the middle. There's 4 cats there. Okay, great. But the right-hand picture, I've concentrated very much on one cat, and also I've played with perspective a bit to have the two up shot. So it's telephoto image, and I've had the cat on the right, the nearer cat, who's actually looking slightly to the left, and then that's balanced by the small distant cat, which is a stronger color. And we'll be talking about balance of tone, subject, and color in a sec. But that orange blob is actually more attractive than the bigger cat because we see contrasty and saturated colors as something that grabs your attention. So they're fighting for attention. So by making that cat blurred and in the distance and small, I've reduced its intensity in the picture, leaving the other cat as the dominant one. So I've exaggerated quite a lot, and I've used perspective to control the arrangement of the subjects. If I'd gone slightly to the right as you look at the picture, I would have had the subject cat on the left and the brown cat in the distance on the right, because I would have moved across. So by moving yourself up, down, left and right, it allows you to arrange objects in your frame in different orientations. And very, very important concept, that. Okay. This is a little more subtle. There's nothing wrong with either of these pictures. The difference is that the left one has a tiny bit of context. You can just see a little bit of what's going on in the top left-hand corner. The right-hand one has eliminated all of those distractions. And I would call the right-hand one a stronger image in and of itself because it's simplified. And that's another word that you should have bouncing around in your head when you're out photographing is, can I simplify this image more so that what I'm trying to show my viewer is clearer? Because at the end of the day, what you're doing is you're saying, hey, look at this, capture it, and then you show it to someone, hey, look at this. You're saying, this is it, I deem this interesting. And you need to communicate that clearly. If you were writing, you'd write a paragraph of description about it. But in photography, you have to frame it, cut it out of the background and capture it. And that's what composition's all about, really, isn't it? And and simplification is eliminating anything in that frame that's not helping, if you can. Obviously, you can't always do that. In the left-hand image, if I had more context, it might actually be a useful picture. And I use the word useful deliberately because there's a difference between a strong image that sits in isolation, if you hang it on the wall or something, and an image which is really, really useful as part of a set of images. so it tells a bit more of a story. So, for instance, the left-hand picture combined with a very, very tight close-up of the ends of these incense sticks might make a nice set. They might not work individually, but together they work really well. So you've got to realize that some pictures work in conjunction with other images and some images stand alone. So this evening we're talking really about standalone images. So images that are composed and set up to stand in isolation. Okay. Don't forget, please do ask questions if you like. I've answered one already, but please do that. If you want to sort of drill down into a couple of things, I'll do my best. Now, this is where that first question from Jay comes into play, because there is this thing which you're bound to have heard of that's bounced around photography circles for just about ever, called the rule of thirds. And fundamentally, that's when you divide a picture up into this sort of grid pattern. And the idea is that if you place regions or points of interest corresponding to those lines, it can strengthen the image. Now, I'm not here to tell you that you should or shouldn't do this, but I would suggest that you remember that off-center subjects are usually, or not the subjects, but the image with off-center subjects is usually more interesting to look at than when it's bang in the middle. Now, the left-hand one isn't really following the rule of thirds, but the face of the lady is above center, and that's important, and we'll come back to that in a sec. The composition here is all about taking your attention to the person doing the weaving, which is why I've used a very, very wide angle lens. I've got very, very close to the actual fabric, and I've used those very, very strong parallel lines with the perspective and the convergence of the parallel lines takes your eye to the subject. But she's not really using the rule of thirds, except that her head's in that top quadrant. The right-hand one, a little bit more so. So the door is in the middle third. The walls, or the door posts, if you like, are in the outer quadrants, and the old man reading is more or less on that conjunction of the line conjunction there. Okay, so it's roughly that. So it's not even a guideline, it's just something to remember, is that try not to put things in the middle unless you are wanting to say very specifically, very static, very stable. So everything has an exception. Okay. Now I've used these images deliberately because they don't really follow the rule of thirds, but if you'd been thinking about it, you might have used it as a bit of a guideline. Like I said, it's just a guideline because obviously the real world doesn't fit into thirds. So how you use that is entirely up to you. Okay. So here's another good example. So this is a perfectly respectable picture of Meteora in Greece. Great atmosphere, was mist around and fog and so on. I've actually cropped this image to make the point, because this is absolutely not how I would photograph it. I would very, very rarely put the subject bang in the middle of the image like this. This is a phone picture, a snapshot. It's okay. One thing it does have going for it is it's balanced. So the two rock formations on the right-hand side and the monastery in the middle do form a balance. So there is a very, very strong sense of stability here, which maybe plays into the fact that these monasteries have been here for an awful long time. Maybe that's what we wanted to say. Personally, I just find it a bit meh. It's not at all interesting. It doesn't give a sense of the scale, because those rock formations are actually quite a bit further away than you think. They're also quite a lot larger than you think. This image does not capture the scale, because I've got a modest size of subject a bit closer, and that's the building, and I've got some really big things further away, but there's no sense of how they connect. This gives you a much better impression of the size and the scale of the rock formations. And because the orange roof of the monastery is the most saturated and strongest color in the picture, that's where your eye is attracted to first. So I've put it off center and down, allowing the looming cliffs to massively dominate the picture and exaggerate the scale, in fact. So I've actually done this the opposite way to the previous picture. I've exaggerated the scale. I've really played to its strengths rather than any other way. And there is this was a tricky one to frame, because I really, if I could just move my mouse into the picture here. Oh, I can't do that on this. Hang on. Yes, I can. I can do it with, there we go. There we go. I really don't like doing this. Having something touch the edge just like that and be cut off is something I would try and avoid. But when I tried reframing it, it made it very difficult. I could make it a bit taller, but I think there was something up here I didn't like. So you've always got these trades off. But where possible, having things break the edge of the frame like that isn't ideal. Now, clearly you can't control everything all the time. There are limits to what you can do. So it was a compromise I had to make. But off center and low. This almost follows the rule of thirds, but not quite. But it doesn't really matter. I think the point here is if you're going to be off center, do it properly. Not just a little bit off center, like near the middle, but well off center, so that it's clear what you're trying to do. And I'll have more to say about clarity and intentionality in a little while, because it's very important as well. Let me just get out of that one. Okay. Off center is very important with portraits as well. I think, and I'm hoping that you will all agree that the right hand image here is weaker than the left hand image, simply because his eyes are bang in the middle of the frame and there's a lot of redundant space. Oops, you can see my hand going out of the crop there. There's a lot of redundant space above his head, which isn't helping the picture. He also, his neck, that's up there, the V of his neck here is taking your eye out of the picture. So your eye can escape through here. There's a dark area here, dark area here. The red of his face takes you down and your eye escapes. Whereas on the left-hand picture, there's a hard line across here, which keeps your eye in the frame. And that whole red area is encapsulated within the frame. There's no escape paths for your eye. That makes the image that much more compelling. Holding the attention is really important. So balance eyes in that, almost on that top third line, roughly, depending on the framing of the picture. It may not be precisely that, but it should be close. And you'll find that a lot of portraits do work a lot better when the eyes of the subject are above that halfway line. Okay. Here's a couple of examples of that. There's a portrait on the left is from Ethiopia. The portrait on the right is from the Gympie Muster. The Gympie Muster a couple of years ago from my festivals book. Both of them are framed in very similar ways. Both of them are a similar distance from the subject. Both of them have that head in the upper portion of the picture, and the eyes are roughly a third down from the top and 2/3 up from the bottom in a vertical framing. And I think you'll agree that these are well-balanced, organized pictures. Your attention on the left-hand side, your attention is held in here because it's the brightest part of the picture. And also eyes and faces are very big attractors as well. So bright, contrasty, colorful face eyes, it's really hard to look away because there's nothing else to look away to. So I've held your attention. On the right-hand side here, same thing. Your eye tends to stay in the brightest part of the picture, which is also a face and also eyes. So I have darkened this part of the picture down a little bit because this map here and his hand was very much brighter than his face, and that actually causes some confusion because your eye tends to go to the brightest part of the picture, and if you've got the main subject competing with another area which is not the main subject but in terms of tonality, your eye can get a little confused, and whilst you won't be aware of it so much, the picture won't be quite as compelling. So this is about that clarity. This is about making sure that your viewer knows where you want them to look every single time. There should be no confusion about what you're trying to show. Okay. Balance is something that's a little hard to measure, but you kind of know it when you see it. The left-hand shot and the right-hand shot are taken in totally different ways. The left-hand shot is with a super wide-angle lens, very, very low, and the right-hand picture is taken with a telephoto lens from a bit further away. But all the elements of those pictures work in balance with each other, and it's just something that you get the hang of. If I framed the right-hand picture let me see, if I moved the frame higher so that the two gentlemen were in the middle of the frame, where are we? Bring up my little spot here. If this extended off the bottom of the frame more, then your eye would tend to escape off the bottom of the frame. And there's a lot of redundant space here. I only need a hint of clouds. I don't need to see more sky. So the framing here is clearly the best way of framing it. In my opinion, again, subjectively. There are other framings, of course. I mean, I've got pictures of this: horizontal, vertical, wider, tighter, all sorts of things. But in this particular framing, the color verticals, those follow those thirds, because there's two subjects which divide the pictures into three, so it's vertical lines. And again, the horizon and their faces are just along that 1/3 down, 2/3 up point, roughly. Again, I'm not measuring it, it's just roughly. This one's a little more complex on the left. The horizon is bang in the middle, and I've almost got 4 photographs in one here. There's the cyclist, there's the cyclist's reflection, there's the building, and there's the building's reflection. And if you divide the picture into 4, you have almost 4 individual pictures. And going back to art history, there is some theorists in the painting world would argue that all 4 quadrants of a painting should include something interesting, to the point where you could almost cut them out and it would still be something interesting. So having an area of just nothingness is to be avoided. Okay. And I think if you look at really strong images, you'll find that that's often adhered to. It may be accidental, but with painting, which is not accidental, obviously you have full control over what goes where on the canvas, you'll find that large parts of that image are actually interesting in their own right. It's just something to keep an eye on for. Again, not a hard and fast rule. So the left-hand picture, I'm going with reflection, and I'm going with symmetry. Symmetry is another topic for a few minutes' time, but that means that the horizon will generally be in the middle of the picture. And in this case, the horizon is, of course, basically that line there, because my camera is almost touching the ground. So it makes sense to do that. If you imagine it framed higher or lower, the balance will be lost. Okay. And now, the other thing about balance is it doesn't have to be subject. It can be tonal as well, and size. You've got size, tone, subject, and position in the frame. This image works because the bulk of those big cylinders, which are very, very dark, is balanced by the bright, small object of the church in the distance. So dark things tend to be not quite as attractive to the eye. Clearly, the white things are, but a small white object can balance a very large dark object. It's almost like scales. The attractiveness of the dark area needs more area to balance the attractiveness of the small area. And in this case, I've deliberately balanced the picture so that you look between the two, but you probably don't look outside that. You look from the tanks to the church and back to the tanks and back to the church. Your eye probably flits between the two. It might do a quick circuit around the outside just to check context, but you'll also notice that I have not included any sky at all. If there was a little bit of sky just ducking in here, and I have cropped the picture accordingly, it would distract you with a bright blob right on the edge of the frame. So an image like this, it's really important to crop out anything distracting, if possible, and go to quite a bit of trouble to make sure that that there's no sky in this sort of picture, because I've pre-visualized what it's going to look like later. In particular, I wanted it to go into black and white. So there's nothing here that's distracting you from the 2 main subjects. And by placing them where I have in the frame, and I can control their relative positions in the frame like this simply by moving me. If I go left, eventually those tanks would obscure the church. And if I go right, then they would separate more. So there's a particular position as I move left and right where they're just nicely balanced in the frame. And you kind of know it when you see it. Okay. When it comes to symmetry, particularly reflections, you might as well go with it rather than fighting against it. And by that, I mean split the picture in half using the horizon so that the top half and the bottom half pretty much match up. That then strengthens the mirror nature of the water. This is up in Chichester National Park, or Chichester or Millstream National Park in WA. I was there on assignment for Australian Geographic, and I came across this person paddling along, and that just gave me that little point of interest. But a couple of things here. First of all, I had no control over where that canoe was. I could have, yelled out and said, stop, turn around, go back. But it was somebody I didn't know. And so this is literally a grab shot. Sometimes you have to make these decisions very, very quickly. I framed it in terms of left-right framing so that the canoe is pointing into the frame. And again, unless you've got good reasons to not do this, it's usually better when a subject in the frame or something in the frame that's important, when it has some sort of orientation or even implied direction. It doesn't have to be actual, it can be implied, like the direction of a gaze of a person. That usually works better when they're looking into the frame, not out of it. Now, you can obviously break that rule very easily and have somebody looking out of a frame or whatever, and it becomes quite deliberately unbalanced and quite edgy, and that may be the effect you want to do. It's like that style of portraiture when the part of the head's cut off or something. I mean, that will have been done very deliberately with full realization of what they're doing. It wouldn't have been an accident. Situation like this, the canoe is, I can't control its position vertically in the frame because I want to go with that symmetry. So I'm stuck with my vertical position, but I can move left to right just by pivoting. And I wanted to plonk that canoe again on the right-hand side of the frame, roughly, so that the motion is into the rest of the frame to the left-hand side. And for me, that's kind of instinctive. If I'd framed it with the canoe leaving the frame, as in I'd framed to the right a lot more, it just wouldn't have been as interesting an image. It might have been perfectly okay, but I think it's better like this. But again, your mileage may vary, as they say. You may choose to do it differently. Just check core questions. No, so far, hopefully everybody's listening raptly. A good turnout this evening as well. Thank you very much. Next one on symmetry. Just a couple of symmetrical pictures. When you've got reflections on the beach, this is the beach is Morton Island, not far from where I live. When the tide's going out, you get that fantastic expanse of wet sand, and you can get these fantastic reflections when you've got good sky. It doesn't work very well when you've just got blue sky, which is really boring, but when you've got good dramatic evening sky, you can get that. And then the left-hand one is just the bow of a boat in Bridport in Tasmania. It's an old picture, that one, actually. And it was just the shapes intrigued me. So I've gone with a very rigid composition, horizon, which is the break between the reflection and the actual subject. That's my horizon, is bang in the middle. But the prow of the boat, which is what the shape leads to, is again off-center. This is a slightly trickier one to frame. It's more 3/4 across from the left, but I wanted to show plenty of the boat's timber work. And if I'd followed the rule of thirds, for instance, that would have been a disaster. So in this case, I've just gone purely with symmetry, and my left to right framing is just when it looked about right. You certainly wouldn't have wanted the prow of the boat too close to the edge of the frame, and by having it too far from the edge of the frame, I'm losing boat, and that's obviously part of the picture. So these are the sorts of trade-offs that you end up making quite a lot. Okay, there's a couple more questions coming here. Just now then, Adrian, the angle of perspective seems strong in the last two pictures. I must have missed this question from before. I'm not quite sure which two pictures you are referring to. Maybe you could make a comment in the chat and I'll come back to them. And then Ian, what about focal length in terms of composition? The focal length doesn't affect the composition except insofar as you can play with the perspective. So what I'm focusing on this evening is I suppose framing and organizing of images and where they should go in the frame, but you use perspective to control where those elements go. And that is very much affected by the focal length of the lens. So everything's kind of joined together. And in these talks, I'm trying to separate out the specific topics so that they, because they're so all interconnected, it would be easy just to talk about all these things at the same time. So I would say that the focal length is subsidiary to your composition. Once you've decided on the frame on the focal length you want to use, if that's possible, then your composition you'll have to compose accordingly. Okay, so and depends on how many variations of the picture you shoot and so on. So it's a little bit tricky to answer. So Adrian, if you want to just mention, the side's about balance. Okay. Let me just go back a couple of frames. Those two, I think. Yes, the perspective is very strong in both of those. That's particularly in the left-hand one. I really do enjoy my super wide angle lens and lots of converging lines. I did talk about that in my talk about lenses. And there's also another, actually it's a YouTube video, sorry, about lenses. And I find that very powerful for this sort of image. So yes, I'm using the perspective there, but I'd already decided on the shot. I'd already decided on the perspective I wanted, and then the composition then followed from that. So again, it's a bit of a chicken and egg situation. Which do you start with? I think some of it comes down to pre-visualization. And also, to be honest, and I think I've said this before, when I have shown that picture of the cyclist before in my talks, it was actually a happy accident. I wasn't actually trying to take that picture. I was demonstrating to a group that I had with me in Cuba how to do puddleography and how effective even a very small puddle, which is only about that big, can be with a very wide angle lens. And just as I was taking the picture, this man cycled through the picture and I happened to catch it. So it was actually a happy accident, that one. The right-hand picture here is very, I shot very, very deliberately. And in fact, these guys you actually have to set up and pay to pose for you these days, because they don't really do that anymore. So we were setting this up as an exercise for my my group in Myanmar, and so that means we can actually have a bit of control. So, but you still got to compose the picture. All right, Owen, the bike was shot on an 18, but it could equally well have been done on 21. Unfortunately, they don't make an 18 Super Elmo anymore. They do the Tri-Elmar, the 16, 18, 21. But the widest fix that Leica makes now for the M's is the 21 mil. Okay, let me get back to where I was. Symmetry. Okay, another very, very powerful subject choice. So this is sort of moving slightly into what you look for to make strong images, is repeating subjects. So something simple like this, which is an iceberg down in on the Antarctic Peninsula, those repeating shapes are appealing in and of themselves, but there's not really a specific subject to frame. It's the pattern that I'm looking for. And I've framed it with just enough water to give you a hint, because if I'd framed it without any water, if you imagine that, if you just block off the bottom of the picture with your hand, you'll probably see that it's really hard to interpret. But as soon as I include a bit of water in the framing, just a bit, it's like the bottom fifth of the frame, it's clear that I'm showing you the repeating shapes in the iceberg, but I need the water there to give the scale, because you kind of know how big water ripples are, roughly. It's not like that. It's clear that those are not 1,000 feet high. It's also clear that they're not a couple of inches high. You get a sense of it. But by doing that, it gives you a sense of scale. And so it's a bit more information, but doesn't take away from the impact of the picture. So repeating things, really, really good. But then you get the situation where you've got a repeating pattern with an odd man out. And then the eye-brain combination really likes repeating patterns with one thing missing. There's a very, very famous picture by Art Wolfe. And if you don't know Art Wolfe, that's Wolfe with an E, absolutely look him up. He's a wonderful photographer and was hugely inspirational to me in my travel work. And in fact, a few of the pictures I've taken have been directly inspired by some of his. And there's one, it's a picture of a whole bunch of monks in Lhasa, I think it is, with those yellow headdresses they have on. They're all looking away from the camera in these lines, but there's one guy who's looking around. And I remember thinking, that's the picture I want to shoot, because the pattern's great, but you break the pattern and it's even better. But you need to have the break in the pattern in the right place in the frame. And in this particular case, that is pretty much a solid rule of thirds. That yellow tulip is pretty much bang on that intersection of the third lines, because it just balances out nicely. The other sharp tulip, this one here, just that one there, it would have been nicer if it had been there, maybe, but then you're getting too rigid. It becomes too contrived. And this is nature, sort of. It's a planted garden in the Southern Highlands of New South Wales. But the point is, I've placed the obvious subject, which is the break in the pattern, on that higher intersection of thirds, and that works just fine for me. It would have been interesting to put it in the middle, maybe. I'm not saying that would be better or worse. It would just be a different interpretation. Okay. Oops, let me get on to the next slide. Now, this is using perspective, so this sort of relates to the question that Adrian and Ian have asked. This is where different focal length requires different composition, shall we say. So again, once I've decided, and these are both exactly the same place. They're both exactly the same tulips, and I've taken them, I'm only a few meters away from the same bed. This is actually, I think this is Butchart Gardens in Canada. I can't remember. Yeah, pretty sure it is. I wanted to portray these very, very spectacular displays of flowers in this garden. And there's two ways I like to do that. One is when you use a telephoto lens, and if you refer back to my depth of field and lens talks, we talk about compression of perspective. So the left-hand one brings all of the flowers together in a much denser mass. And my composition is such that I've used the bottom 2/3 of the frame, more or less, for the flowers, and I've left the top third of the frame out of focus just to give it some depth. And you can see there's more flowers in the distance. So that's having decided to use the telephoto lens, I've composed it in that way. The right-hand picture is taken with the 18mm Super Elmar, with the camera held out in front of me looking straight down. I'm trying to get as high and as over them as possible. There isn't really any composition in this shot, except for the fact that the point that they all converge to is slightly low in the frame, not quite in the middle. That may or may not have been a happy accident. But because I'm super wide and fairly close, the parallel stalks tend to converge towards the center or extend out towards the edge. And it gives you this quite interesting vertical perspective, which is a little tricky to do. The wider the lens, the better. But still, the thing here is that they are two vastly different perspectives of precisely the same subject. And you've got two very, very different images. So from a compositional point of view, the left-hand one is more formally composed, the right-hand one not so much. But still, I have kept that area there is pretty much where, directly under the camera, rather than it being in the middle here. So I've just kept it a bit low so that it fades away to the top. If I'd framed it lower, it would start to look a bit bizarre here. And I may have even got my own feet in the shot, which is something I wouldn't want to do. Okay. All right, using perspective again. Same two guys, same place, different focal length, and then using perspective to then compose the image. So the first shot is with a 24mm lens. So I'm actually using the camera I had on the desk when I was full frame there, which is the SL2, my main camera. First picture, it's a grab shot. It's the first time I'd met these guys. They're in the bar at the Gympie Muster again. And I can see a picture here, but I've got to make contact. So the first thing you do is you say, is it okay if I take a picture? And they go, oh yeah, no worries, mate, whatever. So you grab a shot. Then you see the reaction you get, and you get a sense of their, okay, you can take some more if you want to, rather than if they turned away and kept talking, I might have moved on. But they were happy to have a chat. So then I said, okay, guys, can you just come a little bit towards, just come a little bit towards me, both of them. And then I stepped left slightly, because what I wanted to do, normally I could have got the right-hand picture simply by using the 90mm end of the lens. Okay, but problem is this area here, and these are the sorts of things, let me just get my little spot going. This area here is a huge problem, and this area here is a big problem, because they're in the shade, they're fairly dark, they're very tan, they're wearing black singlets, they've got black hats on. This is very bright, so there's a massive competition between this area and my actual subject. So what I've done is I've moved this gentleman here across a smidge, and then I've stepped across a little bit. So when I frame the right-hand picture, I've used a slightly longer telephoto lens, which narrows the view behind your subject, and I've eliminated those bright areas mostly, best I could do. I've also focused on the nearer person, and I've left the second person to go out of focus. And this is a particular effect I've always enjoyed doing. You can clearly see both of them. You can clearly see their expressions, but the guy in the foreground is clearly the subject, and it's quite powerful for it. Just go back to a question. The picture of the flowers looking down, is the flowers focused on a higher f-stop, say f11? I can't remember. Probably not. With the 18mm lens, you got lots of depth of field. It might have been 5.6. I would be far more concerned about getting it sharp. If I'd had a tripod, or I could have got a tripod into position, then f11 would have been a good choice. It's always that trade-off between, shutter speed, aperture, depth of field, all those sorts of things. So, but it certainly wasn't taken wide open, and it certainly wasn't taken at f16, because I almost never do that. Okay, so back to this one. Back to these guys. So eliminating those bright areas. So that's my composition. I've used the lens focal length. I've used me moving left and right to simplify my picture and balance the picture, eliminate distracting objects, and draw your attention to where I want it to be drawn to. That is effectively framing and composition. There's nothing clever. It's more, in fact, this is probably more of a problem-solving approach than anything creative. Okay, because I'm a documentary photographer, I'm a travel photographer mostly. I'm not an artist. I don't create things from concepts and express them through photography. I capture things that I see, and I try and do that in a way which is appealing to my viewer. So that's usually a problem solving, working with these guidelines I'm discussing to make the pictures look compelling, but I'm not creating anything from scratch. Okay, that's in my mind, that's quite an important distinction. To the next slide. And another example of the same technique. But can you see how both their faces are pointing into the frame? That was very important. Both noses are pointing towards the middle of the picture. And the guy on the right, the main subject, his eyes are above center, so that you've got a nice balance between his turban and his shoulders. And then on the left-hand side, you've got that circular shape. That's actually relatively centered, but broadly speaking, the picture's divided into two. So that allowed me to eliminate some distracting objects, and the rest of it was about waiting for the right expression, which I eventually got. All right, now this is a very important thing. This is less about composition than about your approach, your thought process, and what you should be thinking about. It's be intentional. I've said this to many people over the years, and I know it resonates with some people when you haven't thought of it. If you've already thought of it, it's kind of obvious, but if you haven't thought of it, it can be a revelation. I want your pictures to look like you meant it, not to be lazy. They're not snapshots, they're crafted images. So everything in that picture, as far as is possible, should look like you meant it to look like that. So here's this is in India. It was obviously a pot making place. The left-hand picture, there's an interesting arc of something. I can't even remember what it is. That's important because you don't know what it is either, because I was there. So it's not helping the picture, is it? I've sort of gone for some balance because the curve finishes the frame more or less evenly on either side. So this is kind of centered half-heartedly, but there's no arrangement to the pots, and it's a perfectly reasonable picture. But then all I've done on the right-hand picture is I've tilted the camera slightly to give it a bit more of a cross effect, a bit more dynamic, rather than having the middle line of pots level. And I've found myself an angle, and I've used a focal length that allowed me to eliminate anything that's not a pot. And now we've got the repeating shapes. Would have been nice if one of them had a flower growing out of it or was a different color or something, but it wasn't. But the right-hand picture looks more intentional in my estimation than the left-hand picture. So don't be lazy. Here's a good example of lazy. These are spices and condiments in the spice markets in New Delhi, in India. And The left-hand picture is fine. It's interesting. You show that to somebody and they go, oh, wow, look at all those different colors and shapes and textures. But the right-hand picture is much more interesting, and it's showing exactly the same thing. I've just framed it differently. You'll often find with these sorts of subjects that you wrestle a bit with your framing. Do I go for symmetrical things in the middle? Do I go for off-center? The white, these spices here in the left-hand picture are actually holding my attention, and they're in the middle there. In this one, it's across to the right, which is a bit of a problem, but I wanted to go for some symmetry. So you'll notice I've got exactly 12 pots in the middle. I've got the ones around the outside almost exactly half cut to the best of my ability, so that you've got a series of half around the outside and a series of full circles in the middle to the best of my ability, because obviously these things aren't arranged for photography, they're arranged to be sold, but I've done the best I can. But I hope you'll realize that the right hand one looks more intentional. And here's a little tip, a little secret if you like, is that sometimes, particularly, and I'll use the next picture as a better example, sometimes it's really difficult to control the angle at which you shoot something. You simply can't get where you need to be. The left-hand picture is taken with a wide-angle lens from close, and I'm looking up, and it's at a slight angle, not only up-down, but also left to right. Interesting door. The sky's not really helping. It's slightly skewed. It's a snapshot. But as soon as you step a bit further away, use a slightly longer focal length lens, 50mm, I can eliminate the sky, and by moving further away, my perspective changes and I can flatten it off and I can keep the geometry accurate. And the door is obviously very geometrical, so I should be working with that. And I have done a tweak in Lightroom for the perspective control so that I've made my slightly diverging verticals parallel, because there's no way of getting to them. There's no way of me getting plumb to the center of the door, because that door is about 25 feet high. And so there's no way of me being level with the middle of the door. And that would be the only way I could keep it square in the frame. But by tilting the camera up and knowing that I'm going to adjust it later, I've kept the perspective. It's like architectural photography, really. This is architectural photography, I suppose, is you want the verticals, the horizontals to be fairly plumb. So you can do that, of course, in post, to a limited degree. But I think you'll find that that right-hand picture is much more intentional, looks more organized. It looks like I meant it to look like. Okay, so here's some broken rules. I'm just going to throw up as images because we're on time. That's just pretty good. Way off center, way off the edge of the frame. This was all about the sky and those crepuscular rays shining up into the sky. And this is actually at near Coffs Harbour, a place called Emerald Beach. There's a headland which is almost completely devoid of trees. You get loads of kangaroos hopping around. And a lot of people use the path for their evening walk. And I saw this fella walking towards the crown of the hill with this very distinct stride. He was really plodding along powerfully. So I've decided to incorporate him in the shot simply by reframing and letting him walk into the frame. And I've captured it when he's really off center. So the first thing you see when you see this picture is you see the bright sky, you see the rays, and then you see the little black object. So this is framing and composition that has not had any rules applied to it. To me, it works. There's a certain balance between the brightest part of the clouds and him, bright on the right slightly, he's small on the left, there's a certain balance there. The crepuscular rays are coming up to the left, he's facing to the right, so they kind of meet and hold your attention in the shot. So that one works in that sense. Question from Owen, Howard, didn't they add a perspective control to the M10P in Filmer? Yes, absolutely they did. I think it was the M10R actually, not the M10P. I could be wrong, but definitely the M10R. And as you tilt the camera up and down on the back of the frame, or the back of the camera, you'll see a frame move around and distort, and you can cover your subject with that. And then when you see the image in Lightroom, that transform will be applied to your raw image. You can turn it off if you want to, you're not locked into it, but it's actually really, really neat. So for those shots I just showed you with the blue door, that would have been absolutely perfect. As far as I know, it's not available in any of the other Leicas yet. I'd love to have that on my SL2, but yes, thanks for pointing that out, Owen. All right, next one, same sort of thing. Now, I've put this surfer way off center because the first thing you see here is the patterns of the sand under the blue water. Then you see the surfer, and again, he's pointing to the left slightly into the frame. The top left-hand corner is slightly darker, which holds your eye slightly. And I find that my eye stays broadly within that picture, but explores around nicely and then comes back to the surfer. So he's not on any formulaic composition rule at all there. It's just where I wanted it to be, and I find that works. Same subject, same time, same place, very, very different feel. To me, this is about waiting. This is about having lots of time. This is about nothing particularly happening because it's a square frame and they're plumb in the middle. And that's about as rigid as you can get with any framing, any composition. So those two guys are just bobbing around, talking. They're not even that interested in any waves turning up. They're just out there because they can be, and they're just enjoying the play. So that's why I framed that one that way. Now, obviously, I've cropped that to square, and I've done that deliberately. Interestingly enough, just as a little aside, the squarer an image is, especially a print on the wall, the squarer it is, the more it's seen as an object hanging on the wall. And the more rectangular it is, particularly in a horizontal sense, particularly panoramas, the more it's seen as a window to something. Something I picked up from one of my respected colleagues, Les Walkling, who has a lot to say about art theory. And I remember that very clearly. So the the aspect ratio, the frame shape of your picture has quite a lot to do with the message that you're trying to put across. So you'll see a lot of fine art photographs are a 5:4 ratio and often vertical, and that is seen as quite artistic. Then you've got this thing called the golden mean, which is a 1 to 1.6, and that's actually slightly more elongated than your 3:2 proportion of, say, a normal 35mm full frame camera. So you've got all sorts of options, and they all mean different things in subtle ways. So I'm not going to go too far with that. I just wanted to throw that in just as a bit of a something to maybe look up yourselves later on. Again, rigidity, strength, very, very important for this, because it's all about steel strength. If I don't know how else I would have framed this, and I've gone with square just to keep it extremely rigid and strong and static. So, it speaks of strength to me. So that's kind of breaking the rules, if you know what I mean. All right, just for the last few minutes, I want to just share with you something which will help you with another aspect of composition, and that's not composition in terms of things in the frame, but in terms of light and dark in the frame and things that attract your eye. So tonal composition also helps to hold the viewer's attention and communicate the intent of the image. I'm going to use this example, which I only shot last week. This is up in the rainforests near Kenilworth in southeast Queensland, and it's one of those wonderful strangler figures that puts down those massive buttresses, and it's a perfectly reasonable picture. It's fine. It's a useful picture for me. It's not going to win any awards because we've all seen pictures like this. But so just look at that for a second. Do you find that your eye tends to wander across to the left and up a little bit and then back to the middle? But your eye probably wanders around. It's not terribly sure what to look at. Obviously, the tree is a strong shape, but that left-hand quadrant is actually quite bright. So here's something that you can do to find out where the bright parts of the picture is. That is the same picture in Photoshop, blurred by 200, changed to black and white just by desaturating and flipped upside down. The thing is, I've removed any hint of what the picture is of. All I can see now is the tones. And you'll see that the bright areas are fairly evenly scattered across the picture. And in fact, there's a slight preponderance of brightness in the bottom right-hand side of this image. And if I go back, that corresponds to the top left-hand side of this image. Okay, so that's it's like a tone map of that image. And this gives me some clues as to what I might want to do with a little bit of post-production work, just subtly. Because after post-production work, the same image looks like this. And I'm just going to flick back. So this is before. It's all loose and disorganized. And this is a little more constrained. There's no obvious pathway for your eye out of the frame. Maybe you could argue that here there's a pathway out, and here there's a pathway out, but that part there is definitely darker than this part, so it still acts as a barrier. Now, this is not vignetting as such. This is simply shifting the tones, and the final result looks like that. It's subtle, but that central area, I've darkened the outside of the picture a bit, but what I've done is I've made the center more contrasty and slightly warmer. That's all, because contrasty, warm tone and light is very, very attractive to your eye. And the top left-hand quadrant has now been darkened just a little bit. I haven't done much at all. I'm just going to flick to the before so you can see. And what I want you to look for when I change this slide is how your attention starts to spread and your eye will start to wonder what it's looking at. So can you see how that impact has been lost? Now that is something I do to a lot of pictures. I will emphasize things, hopefully in ways that are not at all obvious. And that's what painters have been doing for thousands of years, is that they know perfectly well that certain tones, saturated colors, bright, contrasty, faces, eyes, figures are attracted to the eye. Your eye seeks them out instinctively. And if there are mixed messages, so that your subject is conflicting with something that's not very interesting, but is actually brighter and more contrasty, the picture will not have much presence. There's a whole theory of this based on some of Rembrandt's pictures, which I might go into at another time, about how you have blocking lines and leading areas of light tone that are cut so your eye can't cross lines, all sorts of stuff. And that's how some pictures can be a lot more compelling than others. It's real subtle. So I'm just going to go back. This is just a stronger image, I think. All right. 3 minutes to go, and there's another question popped up here. I presume this is Ian. Would you have considered a diagonal line in the second picture? Again, sorry to have missed your question. It's a bit hard to, because I'm on a delay. I'm actually ahead of you guys a little bit. So if you just want to make a comment and let me know which picture you're referring to, I will gladly refer to that. But I'm going to basically finish there and ask for any questions you've got, and then we will wrap up. I've pretty much hit the hour, so I'll just see if Ian wants to refer to that picture a little more closely, and then we will move on. So I'm just going to come back to. So yes, I hopefully you'll see what I'm getting at with that last image. Some people think you should get it right in camera, and I would say it's really nice if you can, but nature doesn't always cooperate. So why not make the picture, why not work with the picture's elements to make it that bit stronger, give it a bit of a helping hand? You can take a purist approach, and that's fine. You can go to the limits of post-production, and that's fine too. And then somewhere in the middle will be where everybody else, where everybody is comfortable. And that's your personal style. And don't forget that this picture, as you see it now on the screen, that's the camera's interpretation of the tones. It's not my interpretation. I was very impressed by the tree. And what I'm doing by changing that to, oops, go back that way, to that is drawing your attention to it as well. That's all. Now then, let me just see. Picture of the spices. Yes, okay. So to answer the question, I can flick back. Go back to the spices. Boom, 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 boom. There. Yes, absolutely. You could have done that. Go for a totally diagonal look. I use the dividing line between the trays, two trays, as a strong compositional element. But again, these are the sorts of things you can actually spend quite a bit of time coming up with different interpretations and different framings. That's one of the fun things about composition, is some subjects you've got to think about, shoot a frame, look at the back of the camera. Actually, here's something that I will mention just in passing. One more question from Keith to come up is that whilst I'm not a big fan of chimping on the back of the camera too much, especially when you're shooting quickly and things are happening, when you've got time and you're constructing an image, and this is a good example, the translation from what you see in front of you to it being flattened and displayed on a screen is a really powerful tool to visualize what it's going to look like, or through the viewfinder, of course. So when you're trying to compose a picture really carefully, it's a really good idea to look at the back of the camera or use the viewfinder. Better to look at the back of the camera, actually, because looking through the viewfinder is like looking through something at the real world, but the back of the camera is clearly a flattened, it's like a print. And you'll find that you see things more clearly in terms of your balance and your shapes and your tones on the back of the camera than sometimes you do through the viewfinder or in real life. So it's a nice translation to something that you can interpret and then modify and shoot some more pictures and work it until you're happy. And then you go, yeah, okay, I'm happy with that, and move on. Keith's asking a question, do you ever set your SL2 to a square frame or keep with 35mm? That's a good question. The answer is no, I never do. But sometimes I think I might make this picture square later and I can kind of visualize it. So it's a tool that's there if you need it, but I've never used it. So if you find it helpful, then knock yourself out. But I've never actually used that. I very, very rarely shoot for square. I usually end up with square later when I looked at the picture and decided I want to make it square. I very, very rarely shoot square. And that may have something to do with the fact that about almost 40 years ago now, so the beginning of about 1981, so 40, I bought myself a Hasselblad, which was the best camera in the world at the time, apparently, according to everybody. And it shoots square 6x6, and I couldn't work with it. I just could not take a half decent picture, save my life. I changed to a 6x7 camera, and it worked for me. I hadn't heard about Leica at the time, and I had to shoot medium format for work, so I was limited to my choice. But I couldn't work with square, so now it's really a case of I'll go square later, but not necessarily at the time of shooting. Okay, Keith saying use a Hasselblad for a long time, bit habitual. Fair enough too. Some people it works absolutely in square, and it looks fantastic. Charlie Waite, one of the UK landscape photographers, look him up, Waite. He shoots a lot of stuff in square, and it absolutely brilliant, works for him, just not for this little brain here. All right, that's me done. I just had a little recap slide at the end, which I'll just whiz through and leave on the screen. There it is. So fill the frame, be clear and bold. Think about off-center subjects. Generally focus on the eye and the head and eyes if they're in the subject, if they're in the frame. Look for balance, symmetry, etc. Use perspective to arrange your subjects. Be intentional. Make it look like you meant it. Don't be sloppy. Like, always look at the edge of your frame for things that are just sticking into the frame that shouldn't be there, or the old tree sticking out of someone's head. Those sorts of things. Don't miss those things. And then use tones as attractors. So thank you once again, everybody, for your time this evening. This, I think, is either the last one of the series, or I'm considering doing one more in the new year, which might be about the things that we look for when we're looking for good photographs. Just a little bit more abstract, or a little bit more, it's sort of leading on from this, because there are certain things which will grab your attention, and sometimes it's very hard to know. So I'm going to leave you this thought, because I think I've just talked myself into doing it, is when you are out photographing, so next time you're out photographing, and you stop to take a photograph, can you actually answer the question, exactly what stopped me? Exactly what stopped? What did I just see that attracted me? If you can answer that question, you'll be, you'll find it difficult. And I've got some answers to that question, which we'll do in the new year. So if I don't speak to you in the meantime, have a wonderful Christmas and New Year. Take some time to get out taking some photographs, and I will talk to you in 2022. Bye for now.